Hello there, welcome to our science lesson today. We are looking at destruction of habitats. So previously we have found out that the meaning of a habitat, we said, is the place, the locality where an organism lives, but it must have all the set conditions for the life of the organism or survival of the organism. But we have been able to find out that the habitats do not remain constant. So our questions today: do habitats change? Yeah, it's true that the locality or where an organism lives may change. Sometimes it may remain the same, but most of the time is going to change. And the change that comes in is in form of destruction. They are never dynamic. They are never constant. Habitats are never constant, but dynamic. Dynamic in that the change or the dynamism could be positive or negative. In other words, it may lead to changes in the biodiversity, either positively or negatively. But any change that has not been brought naturally, we call that one as destruction, because it affects the way in which the organism is going to obtain resources from the same ecosystem. So it is usually dynamic. But the reason for change or dynamism are mainly two. As we have already said, some or the majority of change is due to destruction. Change is due to destruction. Now, from the normal understanding of the word destruction is change that occurs in something, so such that it cannot be able to be reversed back to the way it was previously. So sometimes the habitat may change such that it cannot go back to the original status it was found. So the destruction mechanisms, we have said, there are mainly two, can be categorized into two. One, they are intrinsic factors, intrinsic reasons or factors. Intrinsic factors here are the internal factors or internal mechanisms within the habitat that changes or that cause either destruction or a change to the habitat. So when you talk of internal factors, these are mainly natural causes. Natural causes. Natural causes that may destroy or lead to a change in the environment or the habitat. Some of them include, remember we have already said that in a habitat we must have less predation or no predation. Organisms are not supposed to be destroyed completely by their predators. If we have lions and antelopes in that ecosystem, there must be a balance between the lions and the antelopes. Otherwise, if all the antelopes will be preyed on by the prey, that will have offset some conditions in the habitat. So some of the intrinsic factors that may cause destruction or changes in the condition of the habitat include predation. Predation. If there is stiff predation on the prey, it will have offset, it will have changed the conditions that are supposed to allow growth or survival of the prey. So the prey here is the one that will suffer. The prey suffers. Therefore, that habitat does not suit the prey. I've used an example of a lion and an antelope. There must be a balance such that even if the lion shall prey on the antelope, there must be a striking balance. If it is too much predation on the prey, it means the habitat is not well or is not good for the survival of the antelope. We also have other factors like competition. We talked about this severally. We said that if competition is going to be too stiff for another species, especially for interspecific competition, so that the other species is going to be wiped completely from the surface of the ecosystem or from the surface of the earth, then that competition is not good for the habitat. Other include parasitism. Parasite could be there in a habitat, but they are not supposed to infest too much on the host so that the host dies. So those are some of the factors that can lead to destruction or a change in the ecosystem. And the very great one are diseases. If a habitat is infested with diseases, then it is prone to change. It is not going to allow the normal survival of a given organism. And then another category that affects the ecosystem or the habitat are the extrinsic factors. Extrinsic factors. Extrinsic factors are non-natural factors that destroy or that lead to change in the habitat. Now, most of them are caused by human activities. Human activities. So these are mainly human activities that sometimes are deliberate or sometimes they could be accidental activities that will cause a change in the ecosystem. Examples of these include if, for instance, you introduce new species, introduction of new species in an ecosystem. This could be detrimental to the habitat of the native plant because some of the introduced species are invasive. Invasive means they are able to compete the species that were present in that habitat until they either migrate or all of them are going to die or get extinct. So we have several human activities that affect or that change the habitat or that destroy. Human activities that affect habitats. We have just looked at some of them. We have said introduction of species, of new species. Introduction of new species. So species could be introduced in an ecosystem for several purposes, like for as ornaments, ornamental purpose. Ornamental purpose, like some plants. Some could be introduced because of commercial values, commercial purposes, and others could be introduced as biological controls. So this can lead to change in the habitat, in that if this introduced species becomes invasive, if introduced species are invasive, then it is going to change the habitat. So it's going to lead to change in the habitat. So we have several activities. We are going to look at them. We have crop farming. Crop farming. Now, most of the lands previously were occupied by natural vegetation. But due to increase in population, what has happened is that there has been an increase or upsurge in demand for food. So because of that, human beings are always seeking ways of increasing food productivity. For food productivity to increase, they usually invade forest ecosystem or even other ecosystems that were natural for purpose of farming crops. So here it comes with clearing of natural vegetation. So this clearing of natural vegetation has some other effects. Some of the effects that comes with clearing of natural vegetation include destruction of breeding sites. Now suppose we had nesting sites in that grassland or a forest ecosystem. They'll be destroyed from clearance to establish farming or farmlands. Also, it comes with loss of biodiversity. Loss of biodiversity. Loss of biodiversity in that it is just the crop that is being farmed that will be concentrated on. But any other plants that at that time they are not of consequence will be overlooked, they'll be destroyed. So that is what you are calling loss of biodiversity. Biodiversity means a variety of plants and animals that exist in a given ecosystem. So diversity just means variety. Then bio means life, plants and animals. So it has several effects. We shall be looking at each one of them. Other activities include damming. Damming is a common practice, especially in developing countries. So if this is the normal course, suppose this is the course of the river, and then you build a barrier across this. So what will happen? This is a concrete barrier with the regulated flow of water through it. What will happen? This area will become flooded in that manner. So as it becomes flooded, if we had other habitats around this area that were on dry land, terrestrial in nature, they become floods. So with floods, we have several other effects. So maybe you are damming because of power production, or it is being dammed because of irrigation purposes and several other reasons. There will be floods. These floods have several effects like displacement displacement of the habitats of terrestrial organisms, and then sometimes causing water logging. Water logging is when soil becomes too saturated with water, and the effect of that is that it's going to lack oxygen. When soil lacks oxygen, it usually activates activity of denitrifying bacteria. So such soils that are found in waterlogged environment, they become nitrogen deficient. Nitrogen deficient. Soils that are nitrogen deficient cannot be able to support variety of plants, and in turn cannot support a variety of plants. So flooding is one effect. The other effect is that it's going to interfere with the normal course. If, for example, this river was acting as a migratory route or a path for aquatic organisms, there is now a barrier at that point. So it's going to interfere with the normal migration of aquatic organisms, if they are fish, if we have any other organisms. So it interferes. It's going to interfere with migration of organisms. Once migration is interfered, then if they are migrating to look for food, migrating to look for mates, migrating for very many other purposes to satisfy their resources in the ecosystem, then there will be a problem. Survival of the organism is going to be interfered with. So the other effect of damming, again, we can have maybe less amount of water now flowing downstream because much has accumulated upstream. So this one interferes with breeding sites. Breeding sites or spawning sites if it is for fish. Then we also have other activities like urbanization. Urbanization has been known to destroy habitats. It destroys habitat in several ways, but one major way is through clearance of natural ecosystems for purpose of establishing commercial buildings, to establish buildings. So there is clearance of natural sites like forests, grassland, woodlands for purpose of establishing buildings. So that's one. And other effects, like for instance, as there is construction of buildings, what happens? You realize that in urban centers, it is all concrete. So the concretization of the environment has a problem. Is a problem in that if we are going to have concrete all over, it's going to affect several other systems in the ecosystem, like infiltration of water. So this one reduces infiltration of water. Infiltration of water. So if water is not going to be filtered down into the soils, there will be other effects like flooding. Flooding comes with the destruction of other habitats. So urbanization is a very complex problem. We can mention several other effects due to urbanization. Others include logging. Logging simply means cutting of specifically trees that are of commercial value for purpose of for several purposes like fuel, sometime like paper if we have a paper mill around, like for timber production. That is logging. Now, logging is one of the most destructive mechanisms that has ever been invented to destroy habitats, in that you realize that the habitats will go with it. Habitats are destroyed. This leads to a destruction of habitats. As habitats are destroyed, it also leads to biodiversity loss. Loss of biodiversity. And several other effects of logging even include a very serious contributor to global warming. The other effects include fragmentation. Now, we can illustrate fragmentation as this. For instance, if that is a forest ecosystem, we have trees all over like that. But now, due to human activities, such that now we are going to have pockets of natural systems. Maybe there was a road established at that point. So there was need to create a way at that point to establish a road. And then maybe at some other points there was establishment or just clearance for purpose of settlement, forming this. Then maybe there was another activity that led to destruction of that point. Maybe farming purpose, that's a farm. So in the end, the natural ecosystem that was continuous has been broken into some natural pockets of natural ecosystems. So we call this one as fragmentation, breaking down of once a continuous natural ecosystem into pockets. So here we have some vegetation, there, that's natural, vegetation at that point, That is fragmentation. What could be the effect of this? If, for instance, this was a very large forest, and sometimes organisms were migrating from that point A to point B using that route. And we have established a farm at that point. So there will be a disconnect between this pocket here and the rest of the ecosystem. We'll have interfered with natural migratory routes of the that ecosystem or for that organism. So you're interfering with the way it's moving within the ecosystem. And remember, movement is a very important factor for organisms, especially animals, because through movement, animals are able to acquire resources. We have talked about resources several times. So you are impairing the ability of that organism to acquire resources. For instance, there is always a migration of wild beasts. If you have watched wild beasts, if you have watched any film on National Geographic showing wild beasts, very well documented, whereby we have the wild beasts moving across Mara River from Serengeti Game Reserve to Masai Mara Game Reserve. If, for instance, that migratory road or route is going to be interfered by human activities like farms, if we establish there a farm, we establish here a road, we establish other structures like urban centers at that point, is going to interfere with the migration of the wild beasts from Serengeti to Masai Mara. So that is one effect of fragmentation. But we have also seen that it destroys vegetation. When vegetation are destroyed, it comes with loss of biodiversity. Then others include 7, mining. We have different types of mining to obtain mineral ores. Some of them include open cast mining. Now in open cast mining, what happens? The earth is going to be opened up, or this digging of open holes. So that's open cast, so that if that is the normal ground, holes are dark to reach the mineral ores at that point. So what happens if that was a forest previously? Suppose that we had trees at that point. And then you start digging. The first thing that you'll do is clear that point. But as you clear, there'll be digging of soil covering the vegetation. So in the end, the area that has been destroyed even expands. So in the process, you have destroyed the natural ecosystem. At the same time, you have left open spaces or huge open holes. If these holes are not going to be reclaimed, remember, they can accumulate water. If it accumulates water, it becomes a hazard even for human beings, breeding ground for any other organisms. For instance, if it's going to be mosquitoes, then they're going to breed and transmit or be agents of transmission of Plasmodium, which is a very important agent for malaria. So open mining has several other effects because it also comes with machineries. If you are going to have machinery being involved, we have effects like noise coming from the same. We have fuel being deposited, residues of fuel, which has effects like cloaking the body parts of organisms, cloaking soils, and in the process interfering with normal respiration in the habitat. So several activities have been cited. We are not going to look at all of them, but the most prominent ones, even pollution. Pollution, we have already found out the meaning of pollution. When you introduce unwanted material in the ecosystem that has harmful effect on the life, then that is pollution. So if we have factories being established around and there is no proper ways of disposing of the waste products from the factories, then it leads to pollution, because from the factories we have emissions, specifically of gases like carbon dioxide. So if factories is going to use fuel and that fuel emits, the emissions are just let into the atmosphere, there'll be release of gases like carbon dioxide, gases like sulfur dioxide. So emissions could be carbon dioxide. Could be sulfur dioxide. And several others. Remember the effect of carbon dioxide. It is a greenhouse gas. When it is released into the atmosphere, it forms a blanket in the atmosphere. It forms a blanket in the atmosphere so that if we are going to have sun rays, they'll pass through, but when they hit the ground, they are reflected in form of short wavelength. Therefore, they cannot escape into the atmosphere. Here, it becomes more warm. So, in essence, carbon dioxide leads to global warming. Sulfur dioxide, when it dissolves in water, it forms acidic rain. Acidic rain has several effects, like even corroding structures, but of importance in relation to habitat, it destroys the pH of the habitat, therefore interfering with the normal functioning of the organisms. So we can have in form of emission from factories, maybe sludge from factories, again, sludge. Emissions are in gaseous waste materials that are in gaseous form. But now sludge is waste materials from the factories in form of liquid being released into the river system or aquatic system. If they are introduced into aquatic system, then several effects can come in, and one of them could be fish kills. It might lead to fish kills. Introduction into aquatic system may also lead to other effects like changing the pH of the aquatic system. And even temperatures. Some of the sludge could be in form of hot water from the factories. This will interfere with the temperature. So the water becomes more hot. The aquatic system becomes more hot, or there is increase in temperature. Effects of these are many, like even causing a death to aquatic organisms, but also increasing how gases escape from the aquatic system, because solubility of gases usually decreases with increase in temperature. So as water temperature increases or aquatic system temperature increases, less gases will be dissolving, or in other words, more gases will be escaping from the ecosystem. Other activities like irrigation. Irrigation is good. We know that it can be able to enhance food production. But with it also comes with other effects like maybe salting. Salting. So what's the meaning of salting? Now, we know that if that is the soil profile, and the water table is at that point, during irrigation, what will happen to the water table is that it will increase. Water table in the soil column. Now suppose we have salts at that point. We already have dissolved salts. During irrigation, you are supplying more water to the column of the soil. So you are increasing the water table. Water table maybe rises up to that point. So the same comes with the salts. The salts that were down in the rocks here will now rise up the soil or the topsoil. Now, if soil has high concentration of salts, there will be a problem because some of the crops cannot be able to survive saline environment. So that's why we are saying irrigation coming with salting is going to interfere with the habitat at that point. So if we had some vegetation at that point that was surviving due to less salts, and now we have more salts that has risen above the normal water table that has come about due to irrigation, then those plants are definitely going to die. That is common. For example, if we have an ocean, and then it just maybe more water, if we had plants here growing at that point, just along the shores. But now the level of the sea, remember seawater is salty. The level of the sea just rises, maybe due to high tides to that point. These plants, after some time, they are not going to remain the same. They are going to die because they are not used to salt condition. But now the environment here has become salty. So that's why they are not going to survive, but they die. So those are some of the few activities of man that affects the habitat. Now the question is, does it matter about these activities? Yes, it matters because those activities have a lot of effects of destruction to habitats. So there are so many effects of destroying the habitat. Why you destruct the habitat and effects of destruction. Let us just write the spelling correctly. Destruction to habitats. We have found out several effects. So some of the effects, as we have been able to find out, is that it leads to loss of biodiversity, loss of biodiversity. Leads to loss of biodiversity. Now, previously we have just looked at the meaning of biodiversity. Diversity means variety. Then bio means life. In this sense, we have plants and animals. So loss of biodiversity simply means plants and animals, the variety or the species that were there are going to be reduced. We have looked at how some of the activities may lead to loss of biodiversity. Logging, one of them, destroying plants. When plants are destroyed, because they make food for the animals, then it will follow that animals are also going to die. Now, sometimes the loss of biodiversity has happened so that it leads to this phenomenon, extinction, leading to extinction. Now, one major activity that we have not maybe looked at, for instance, hunting of some animals for purpose of maybe acquiring some materials from them meant for as ornaments. It has been established that most of the organisms that are hunted are becoming threatened. One of them, we have a tiger called Indo-Chinese tiger. It is just threatened, on the brink of extinction due to activity of man hunting. So it is actually a reason for loss of biodiversity. Other effects, as we have said, we have mentioned briefly, it may lead to global warming. Global warming, some of the human activities. We have found out that factories are able to release emissions. Some of the emissions include greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases. Now, greenhouse gases include gases like carbon dioxide. You'll allow me to use symbols because you already know. It also includes gases like methane gas. And then sometimes water vapor has been classified as a greenhouse gas. We know the effect of these gases. They usually form a layer in the atmosphere. And once they form a layer in the atmosphere, a blanket, that blanket allows sun rays to pass through, but does not allow reflected radiations to escape into the atmosphere. The effect is that that atmosphere, or that part that has been covered with the blanket of greenhouse gases, becomes more warm. When it becomes more warm, it's going to affect several things or several phenomena like rainfall formation. Rainfall, it may lead to cases of drought. It may lead to melting of ice caps. Melting of ice caps. Melting of ice caps can lead to flooding. And flooding can lead to spread of diseases. Spread of diseases may lead to spread of diseases. So, just from emission of greenhouse gases, we have seen a series of activities happening, either affecting the seasons of rainfall. Sometimes rains maybe not coming for a longer time. We call that condition as a drought. Sometimes melting of ice caps that were originally continuous sources of water from the mountains down, forming streams and flowing into rivers, into lakes and oceans. And then if we have continuous melting of ice caps leading to flooding. So we have a series of effects just from the human activities that has increased emission of gases, of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, leading to all those activities. Other effects include reduction in population of organisms, now, there's a slight difference between loss of biodiversity and reduction of population, although reduction of population may lead to loss of biodiversity. But if for example, we are just considering one species A, there were many in an ecosystem, and then the population starts to drop. That is an example of reduction in population of organism, as we have already pointed out, from activities like pollution, from activities like logging. Then again, this one may lead to loss of resources meant for the organisms in the ecosystem. Resources, we have come across the word resources in the ecosystem severally. Maybe just a reminder, we have talked about food. If we are going to have global warming interfering with patterns of rainfall, maybe having longer dry period spells than wet spells, production of food will be interfered with. That is a resource in the ecosystem. Other resources include even nets. We have looked at activities like fragmentation, interfering with migratory routes. If organisms were moving from one point to another in search of mates, you have fragmented the land or you have fragmented the forest. The effect is that they'll interfere with mates. So other resources also include nutrients. We have just seen how irrigation or how damming and irrigation can be able to affect the aeration or aeration ability of soils. When soils are waterlogged, most of the gases escape. This allows microorganisms that convert nitrates to free nitrogen. Denitrification, in other words, those microorganisms will lead to denitrification of that ecosystem. So in the essence, if we are going to have a waterlogged environment, this is a waterlogged environment, most of the nitrates that were here will be converted to free nitrogen. That free nitrogen cannot be used by the plants. So in essence, an ecosystem that was rich in nitrates becomes deficient in nitrogen. Because of that, that's why we are talking of loss of resources in the ecosystem. So one of the nutrients will have been lost. Nitrates will have been lost due to water logging. So we have several of those resources. Even pollinators are going to be lost. Pollinators is also an example of resources in an ecosystem. If we are going to interfere with forests so much or wetlands so much, pollinators, insects, will also, they may die or they may migrate to areas where conditions are suitable for them. So effects are so many. We can just look at but a few. It also leads to effect like decreasing diversity of plants and animals. Take this example. If you are going to encourage farming or breeding of food crops only, or both cash and food crops, what's going to happen to the wild plants? There'll be a problem on wild plants because a lot of efforts are being put towards breeding of the crops. Any wild plant, the only fate that it meets from human being is clearance, removing it from the ecosystem. If that process continues for a longer time, there is a likelihood that there'll be a decrease in the species of plants, such that now only targeting or only remaining some few plants, because you are now looking at wild plants as either weeds or non-beneficial. So most of the efforts are going toward breeding of the crops. If this is going to happen, it might lead to loss of diversity of plants, which in turn leads to diversity of animals. The same way, we have a lot of efforts going toward breeding of animals that have a more commercial values, like if they are going to give us milk, if they are going to give human beings honey, or something that we can directly benefit, but at the same time neglecting wild animals. Wild animals. That is why, if we talk of extinction histories or threatened species, endemic species, they are mostly for wild animals, not domesticated animals, because right now human beings are viewing wild animals, unless there is a lot of awareness that wild animals do not have value. They have to be killed and be replaced with domesticated animals. This effect of decreasing diversity can have other effects, like increasing cases of both diseases that affects plants and animals, because now you are targeting or improving the population of one type of organism at the expense of the other. So in the end, you realize that we have maybe development of resistant diseases and resistant pests. So in the end, formation of resistant diseases and pests. Because now these diseases and pests can be able to survive very well with the crops that you are breeding. You are breeding a crop that forms a very good host for the diseases, that forms a very good host for the pests. So they are just going to increase. And the wild plants that were resistant to the diseases, or the wild animals that were resistant to these diseases, have been destroyed, or their diversity has decreased. So in the end, we shall have a population that cannot be able to handle the diseases, that cannot be able to handle the pests, because of emphasis on one type of animal or plant. So we can look at slightly something different. Introduced species. Introduced species. So if, for instance, we take an organism from Africa, maybe for several purposes that we are going to look at, and then we introduce this species in Australia. This organism A has moved to that ecosystem. The normal native range is Africa. Native range is Africa. The native distributional range has been changed from Africa to Australia. We shall call this species A as introduced species. This is an introduced species because it has been transferred from its native distributional range to a new range or a new ecosystem. We call that one as an introduced species. Some of the reasons for introducing species, this could be, for instance, commercial value. Commercial value. Maybe you have introduced an animal like a zebu cow because maybe in Australia there could be a problem with the disease. In fact, there's an Indian, suppose it is an Indian, there is an Indian breed that is even performing better than most of Indian cow, that is now has been established to be performing well in production of milk. If it's going to be introduced into Australia, then that one is an introduced species, but for commercial value to produce more milk. So the reasons could be for commercial purposes. Other reasons could include maybe as a pet. You can get an organism from one point to another just because you want the organism or the animal to give you company, sometimes as an ornament. Especially for plants, and sometimes, which is very important scientifically, to act as a biological control. Biological control. To act as a biological control. But what's the noting about introduced species? Some of the introduced species into other continents or into other countries or into other distributional range, they can be able to cope so well. They compete very successfully until it leads to extinction of the native animals and plants. If you are going to have a such species that is introduced and then it outcompetes existing native organism, we call that type of an animal or organism as an invasive species. So some of the introduced species, become invasive. So what is the meaning of invasive? An invasive species is one that when introduced into a non-native ecosystem, it outcompetes the native species. So in the end, you realize the population of introduced species has become more than the native species. So we call that one as an invasive. It was introduced for very good reasons that we have mentioned: ornamental, commercial, as a pet, as a biological control, but now outcompetes the native species. So in essence, it is altering the condition of the ecosystem, the habitat. Therefore, an invasive species has disadvantages. It is disadvantageous to the non-native species. So it does not help matters. Instead, it even changes the biodiversity. It may lead to loss of biodiversity, especially of the native, because of competition. Remember, we have talked about interspecific competition, where maybe the invasive species has successful competitive mechanisms as compared to the native species. So it displaces it completely from the ecosystem, either through migration, either through death and extinction. So examples of these invasive species in Australia, we were able to mention examples of these, examples of invasive species. So we talked of some feral animals, feral cats. We talked of feral camel. We have foxes. The European rabbits, and several others. But just to remind ourselves, feral, we said a feral animal is the one that was domesticated, but now runs into wild and becomes a wild animal. So it was once domesticated, like the cats, the camel. So once domesticated, it was once a domestic animal, but now it goes into wild. When it goes into wild, it is out of control by the owner. So it becomes feral. So I'm just finishing. So just something small on biological controls. So we have mentioned that some of the introduced species could be biological controls. So what's the meaning of a biological control? So when, for instance, we have a pest in form of an animal A, which is a pest, but you do not want to use maybe chemicals, maybe physical methods, but you want to use biological methods to control this pest A. You are going to introduce a natural enemy. Introduce a natural enemy into the ecosystem. That natural enemy could be an organism B. So B is a natural enemy that now controls reproduction or population of an organism A. We call this one as a biological control. Biological control. So this is what I just wanted us to get, that if you are going to have an organism B controlling the population of an organism A that is harmful, that organism should be harmful and is being controlled by a natural enemy that is less harmful or has no harm. Then we call that organism as a biological control. We can use an example. If we have a cat here that is not very harmful or that has no harm, and then we have rats. Then you want to use the cat to control the population of rats. Then the cat becomes a biological control. So with that, we are coming to the end of this chapter, and remaining part is a small part of energy flow in an ecosystem. Thank you.